that so many anchors on MSNBC, for example, are losing their minds daily is because our side is winning. And so I come full circle in this response and just want to encourage you with some substance that we are in the process of the Second American Revolution, which will remain bloodless if the left allows it to be.
Hello and welcome to FFRF's Ask an Atheist. I'm Jayne, Senior Policy Counsel at the Freedom from Religion Foundation. Today we're talking about the threat Project 2025 poses. That alarming clip you just saw was of Kevin Roberts, head of the Heritage Foundation, which is one of the major groups behind Project 2025, a 900-plus page Christian nationalist playbook to reshape America. We'll be talking about the Presidential Transition Project with the Washington bureau chief at The Guardian, who's been tracking this story closely. But first, I want to introduce my co-host today, FFRF Director of Governmental Affairs, Mark Dann, coming to us from Washington, D.C. Hey, Mark.
Hey, Ryan, great to be here with you. As always, we want to hear your questions, so put your thoughts and questions in the comments section or email them to askanatheist@ffrf.org.
Quick little note, FFRF is a 501c3 nonpartisan organization, so we do not and cannot take sides in partisan elections and don't necessarily endorse any such views that might be expressed here today. Now our guest is David Smith, the Washington bureau chief for The Guardian. From 2009 to 2015, David was a correspondent for The Guardian in Johannesburg, South Africa. David has written numerous articles on Project 2025 and the U.S. elections. You can find David on Twitter at SmithInAmerica or at theguardian.com. Welcome to the show, David.
Thanks, great to be here.
And before we get into our discussion with David, we want to hear from you with our audience question. So for today, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much of an impact do you think Project 2025 will play in the election and why? 10 is a huge impact and 1 is no impact at all. So, David, let's talk a little bit about your work. And in your recent article at The Guardian, you quoted California Representative Jared Huffman, who's the founder of the Stop Project 2025 Task Force, and who called Project 2025 a potential wrecking ball to the federal government. Can you elaborate on how this plan could fundamentally alter the structure of American democracy?
Yes, Project 2025, this more than 900-page document from the Heritage Foundation think tank, is really a very radical, sweeping plan that would centralize power in the presidency and pursue what Steve Bannon always called the dismantling of the administrative states. Among other things, it would essentially lead to the dismissal of tens of thousands of federal government employees and allow them to be replaced by what are effectively political employees who would be pretty much vetted to ensure that they were loyal to Donald Trump. It would abolish the Department for Education, for example, and it would really be a step towards what many fear is an authoritarian presidency, which we've heard enough from Donald Trump to suspect he would love that and exploit it to the full.
And here he would just be a dictator on day one. So if you can just tell us, how would Project 2025 impact my daily life? I wake up in the morning, what's changed for me personally?
Yeah, and you mentioned Jared Huffman and that Stop Project 2025 Congressional body. We're going to hold hearings. I think they're trying to really hammer this message home about how it would affect people's daily lives and really trying to tie Donald Trump to Project 2025. It's everything from climate. They certainly want to defund a lot of climate activities, so that would impact us in the short and long term. LGBTQ rights would be rolled back. Certainly, abortion rights would suffer yet another blow following the fall of Roe versus Wade, and so again, as we've already seen, millions of women, potentially millions more women, would be affected by that. There's some very tough measures planned on immigration, again, echoing Trump's policies of deporting undocumented immigrants. So again, thousands, if not millions of people will be affected by that. And, the plans for the economy, taking a tough line on China, I think there would be a danger of increased inflation and other ways in which that would impact people in their daily lives.
Thank you, David. So it's, as you're saying, this touches on just myriad of different issues. And anyone who's a member of FFRF would know that a lot of the things you just mentioned are adjacent to state-church separation. So we're going to get into some of the more specific state-church implications of Project 2025. But first, we have a clip from the Heritage Foundation promoting Project 2025 from their perspective. Let's take a look, and then we'd like to hear your thoughts, David.
On Inauguration Day,
the 4 years ahead
seems like an eternity.
It's not.
Because the left has engineered our government and institutions
to reject conservative ideology. The 2025 Presidential Transition Project
brings together over 60 conservative organizations
to ensure the policy and personnel are in place.
On January 20th, 2025.
Using 4 pillars,
we are laying the foundation
for the next president
to end Washington's bureaucracy and restore American prosperity.
Well, we've been here before. The Heritage Foundation had a mandate for leadership in the early 1980s that was very influential on the Ronald Reagan presidency. And now I think we see potentially history repeating itself, but on steroids. I mean, this document is extremely radical. It's a culmination, really, of the Trump era. And by one estimate, about 140 Trump administration officials have worked on it, despite his attempts to distance himself. And certainly many of its critics say that Christian nationalism is really at the heart of this document. It's very sort of old-fashioned Christian conservative language about the importance of the nuclear family, family life. It's got those echoes of Make America Great Again. It's certainly not a document sympathetic to LGBTQ rights. It proposes, in addition, defunding diversity, equity, inclusion programs. The whole thing is really a throwback, and it's certainly supported by many of those Republicans who you've heard questioning the separation between church and state. Those who argue, we don't want the state influencing the church, but we're very happy for the church to influence the state.
Right. And one of the things that we see coming out of Project 2025 is that pretty much on the first day of a future extraordinarily conservative administration would issue an executive order that would grant pretty much a religious exemption to almost every facet in American life, whether it's in healthcare or accommodations, you name it. It's going to Project 2025 would allow that to happen and give the muscle and the full force of the federal government to enforce that type of decision making, eroding the separation of church and state. So do you see something similar? And then broadly, what do you think could be the consequences for the separation of state and church?
Well, I think one interesting aspect of this is that we're already seeing Project 2025 enacted in certain red states, whether it's the 10 Commandments being put up in classrooms in Louisiana, or extremely strict abortion bans in Texas and elsewhere. At state level, they're a laboratory for Project 2025, these religious exemptions, and I'm sure that would continue, and you would potentially have some major legal battles between a state such as California, for example, and the federal government, and that might go all the way to the Supreme Court. And of course, we know which way the Supreme Court is leaning these days with that very right-wing majority. But yeah, I think this document does set up a final victory for the Christian right, and sadly, those people who don't want to make a wedding cake for a gay couple, or don't want to preside over a gay couple's wedding, would be in the ascendancy, and then you ask those worrying questions about could the Supreme Court even pursue the right for same-sex couples to marry at all, which at one point seemed unthinkable, but then of course the overturning of Roe versus Wade also seemed unthinkable at one time.
So, and just in terms, so basically, if you see what's happening in Texas and you're moving, that's the sneak preview. And in British speak, how bad is worrying? Is that a 10 alarm or is that a 1 alarm?
The British are famous for their understatements. So you should take everything I say and dial it up by at least 10 points, I would say. When I say concerned, it probably means that you should panic.
And I would also add, part of what you're talking about, it's hard because it touches on so many different issues. Project 2025 is such just a huge document. It's hard to wrap your head around it. But there's also this central theme, right, that in Project 2025, they have a huge coalition of groups that they want to be influencing public policy, and they want to be consolidating power in the executive, in the Oval Office. And so what I always come back to is, even if something is not explicitly in Project 2025, if it's not written out in there, there are groups that FFRF goes to battle with all the time, like First Liberty Institute, that are involved with this project. And so these are the decision makers who they are putting at the levers of power, and then they're consolidating power in them. So it's scary to think what direction they might take it in, because they can really kind of do whatever they want if they get everything that's in here. I'm curious.
Yes, can I just add to that?
Of course.
That, a few weeks ago, I interviewed Steve Bannon, former White House chief strategist, longtime advisor to Donald Trump. Went to his basement office on Capitol Hill, which is alarmingly close to the Supreme Court, and he had a copy of Project 2025 there. And at one point, he pointed to it and said, "That's the Bible." And it reminded me that the likes of Steve Bannon and his ideas, his populist nationalist ideas, would be empowered by that, along, as you say, with all these satellite groups. On the other hand, if you want to clutch at straws or have a more sort of consolation, I do think, as we've seen playing out in recent weeks, there is some rivalry between these groups. There was a Trump legacy think tank called the America First Policy Institute, and they have some different ideas, and I can imagine they have some disputes, some rivalry with Project 2025, and then other groups as well. So this everything you say is true, but there's also a sliver of possibility here that some of these groups might be at each other's throats.
Sure, that's really interesting, and it makes sense. We've seen, especially I think since there's been such negative press of Project 2020 and kind of shining sunlight on it, there are some groups that really want to distance themselves from it. And I'm wondering if you can speak more to what the response has been to Project 2025, both from the public and also from political figures.
Yeah, isn't it always interesting how some ideas and proposals and brands catch fire and others fly beneath the radar? I think there's just something about the name Project 2025 and the group behind it, the Heritage Foundation, now 50 years old, that captured the imagination on both sides of the aisle. So Republicans were very happy to.
We may have lost David for a minute. I think we'll just give him a moment to reconnect.
Right. And I think what's also really interesting is what David's saying in terms of Steve Bannon. They're getting excited about this. They're seeing how this is moving. So I think it's really interesting to see how someone like Steve Bannon, who, for years is fringe and then every year seems to get closer and closer to mainstream, very conservative thinking, that definitely folks who think like him in a future right-wing administration are going to have really unbridled control. Seems to be my takeaway from a lot of this discussion.
Absolutely, and it's seeing, as David was hinting at, it's a lot of groups that historically have not always been allied on everything. So when you get that many people into a room, they can't possibly all agree on everything. So for instance, I know recently the Discovery Institute, this kind of fringe group that tries to push intelligent design, like the new branded creationism, they recently left the Project 2025 coalition. They say they don't want to be associated with it anymore, which I think is kind of hilarious. When you are at a point where the creationists are no longer wanting to be associated with you, your reputation is really suffering.
So on a screen scale, so it's like on the right side, so Project 2025 is further to the extreme right than creationism?
In a sense, yep. It's too hostile.
Okay, I know we were talking in the warm-up to the show of things that surprised you. That's my surprise of the day.
There you go. Mark, can you maybe share some of your thoughts in D.C. and being closely connected to our congressional allies on some of the stuff going on with Representative Huffman's Stop 2025 task force?
Yeah, I think that's a really good response that you're seeing coming from Representative Huffman, who many of our viewers know is the co-chair of the Congressional Free Thought Caucus. And I think it's a really strong personal point of pride that the Free Thought Caucus was on this before almost any other faction or caucus or group in Congress. So nice job, free thinkers, for seeing this, and nice job for the caucus that this is something we saw early and is giving a lot of attention to. And then you're also seeing that it definitely had a lot of other folks within the Democratic caucus going into the administration that you've seen the reaction from campaigns. I think it's going to be really interesting to see what it comes out and what is the next step. And sort of one of the things that I think is going to be interesting is that you've actually seen a pretty good response from the Democratic caucus, where whether it's the Stop the Comstock Act or it's voting rights legislation or a few other areas that definitely go up against Project 2025. So I think with Representative Huffman, you are seeing this really good wall that can be built through legislation, through activities, to make sure this doesn't happen again.
That's great. I love seeing the secular allies we've seen taking the lead. So David is rejoined. Welcome back. And we were just discussing Representative Huffman's Stop 2025 task force. What can you share? What are some of your perceptions of that task force?
Yeah, and I first married Huffman, doing an article about him, the first non-believer in Congress. I don't quite describe himself as an atheist, but certainly a free thinker and an interesting guy. This task force, I think, goes to how Project 25, like so many things in politics, both a radical right Republicans, but the sort of opposite or reaction on the Democratic side. Rather than nebulous policy proposals or fuzzy warnings about what Donald Trump will do, here it is set down in black and white. It's the literal document that you can dissect and analyze. That's a very useful tool for Democrats to issue a stark warning to their voters on what to expect. Huffman, a lot of civil rights groups are going to be involved in this. A lot of Congress, including Jamie Raskin, always very impressive. They're going to hold a series of mock hearings, set out, give it a public airing as to what the implications of Project 2025 would be. Perhaps unsurprisingly, we've heard a little bit less about that in the last few weeks with assassination attempt on Donald Trump and a switch of Democratic candidates. A little bit hard to get airtime into this, but I'm sure it will come back. And I think sensing that data, to go back to your earlier question, that's partly why you are seeing Donald Trump especially try to distance himself from Project 2025. But he knows that some of its contents are very extreme. They give Democrats a weapon, especially the crackdown on abortion rights. I think his sense tells it obviously a big leader for Republicans and trying to be vague on that. And other things in there as well. Just a little too stark when he would prefer to be vague. Last week at the Republican convention,
and I think that's a really important key is in terms of what Huffman and the Congressional Free Thought Caucus and other members of Congress are planning on doing, whether it's the shadow hearings, those can have floor speeches or things like that. So I think that, and coming from The Guardian, I think that is a pretty credible source of where you can see this group going, hopefully in the near future.
So could we do a quick rundown, David? You mentioned a bunch of the different areas that are impacted directly in Project 2025. One that you mentioned is the world of civil service, when we call Schedule F, and I know John Oliver did a really nice breakdown of some of the implications of that. Public schools, so the Project 2025 calls for shutting down the Department of Education entirely, so massive impact on public schools. You mentioned reproductive freedom, LGBTQ+ rights, racial justice, immigration. Those are some of the things that you've mentioned. But these are all concerns that are kind of domestic. So I wonder, with your international experience, people are talking a lot about these domestic issues. I'm wondering if you can give some thoughts on what the international view of Project 2025 might be and how it might affect people beyond the borders of the United States.
I think the principle
All right, David, I'm so sorry. You're breaking up. It's the audio's not coming through right. So I think we're going to have to end it there. I'm so sorry, but okay, yeah. So Mark, we can hopefully fill in some of the gaps there. Appreciated having David on the show for as long as we could. Apologies for technical difficulties. We will fill people in with David's thoughts, because I'm sad. I was really looking forward because, as we mentioned, David has all this international experience, and really want to hear his thoughts on that topic. So we'll return to that at some later point.
Yeah, and I think so it just gives us a good reason to have David back on the show. But just for folks, in terms of The Guardian, his point of view is obviously what are the impacts going on? How could Project 2025 impact whether U.S. steps back and becomes more isolationist, whether it definitely is going to be an impact on State Department funding, USAID, maintaining religious freedom abroad. And so I think those are going to be some interesting questions that they have on that. And then, quite frankly, I think he hopefully next appearance can talk a little bit about, is Project 2025 just a copy and paste job that you're seeing coming out of Russia or Hungary? So there's a lot to talk about, or whether it's with the UK elections and the rise of the Reform UK party, which is much more of a right-wing party that we've seen more than the Tories itself. So hopefully we can talk with David really soon about a lot of this. So stay tuned for an encore presentation.
Absolutely. I look forward to that discussion and hearing David's take on all of that. We're going to skip ahead to audience questions because we are getting a bunch of them. So apologies if these are directed to David specifically, but Mark and I will do our very best. So the first question is, are there ways that Project 2025 can be stopped if some of these proposals were to be put into motion? Okay. So yeah, go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I think the best thing to do is make sure there is not a extraordinarily right-wing presidency that goes into place. The next big question would be, is there a right-wing control of the Senate? If that doesn't happen, where the Democrats have more hold on to the Senate, that means they can block appointments. That means they can slow down whether it's judicial appointments and be a block on that. A big area, and then or even Supreme Court justices that come up. But the big threat that's out there is how friendly are the courts going to be to Project 2025 and their ideas. We saw in Trump versus the United States that looks like the Supreme Court's going to be very accommodating. So the best thing to do would be make sure this doesn't happen, and also look for places where you can influence that.
Yeah, I mean, that all sounds right to me. Of course, groups like FFRF are going to be out there fighting every inch of this if it were to to come into existence. Another focus that we would take would be onto states and state courts. So, Mark, you were talking about kind of political solutions and how it's potentially very hard to settle these things in courts, especially if the federal judiciary has been packed with people who support these ideas. You're not going to get them to overturn them. But state courts are a separate avenue. And remember, state courts handle the vast majority of court cases in this country. So we've seen a refocus on state legislatures politically and also on state courts, state Supreme Courts and lower courts, who can potentially help to mediate some of the damage that these policies would do if they were implemented. So great question. Here's another question about kind of a feeling of doom and gloom. So Mark, I think you're very optimistic. I think you're a good person to answer this. So they're asking, in some of the online communities I've seen discussing Project 2025, there's been a heavy emphasis on immigrating to a different country to escape it. And I remember this, similar discussion in 2016 where people were very afraid and saying, I got to get my passport in order, get ready to get out of here. Do you have a response or a suggestion to people who feel that level of hopelessness in this situation?
I think in terms of, let's look deeper about what's happening in the election itself. And I think Wisconsin is a really good example of good currents that you're seeing. So Wisconsin itself, okay, swing state, competitive Senate seat, but you've got in Congressional District 3, you've got a competitive House race. But even further down the surface is that you've got all of these new maps that are fair, and you're seeing areas in Wisconsin that haven't seen a really competitive campaign. So that's more opportunities to get involved with and to reach out to people as well. Plus, quite frankly, I mean, you're going to have an even Steven chance that there's not going to be anyone putting their thumb on the scale in counting the ballots in Wisconsin. So I think I would say to folks, don't agonize, as Nancy Pelosi would say, don't agonize, organize, and especially think about areas down ballot where you can help and you can knock on doors, you can do what you think is best. You can engage in a lot of those campaigns, and quite frankly, they would love to have your support. So think down ballot.
Awesome. Love that. Now, I can take a crack at answering this next one, which is, well, many people are against Project 2025. There are some people who don't seem to be particularly bothered by it. Why do you think that is, and what could I say to someone who falls into that category? So my thought would be, with a thing like Project 2025 that touches so many different areas, if this is somebody who whoever this person is, I would kind of try to enter their mind a little bit and figure out what issues do they care about, because chances are very good if they learn what is in Project 2025 in more detail about something that they're passionate about, they're going to change their mind about it. So I think it's probably this is a spot where you need education. So you have to kind of figure out, do they care about public schools? Do they have friends who are in the LGBTQ communities? Do they know any women who might be impacted by the reproductive rights aspects? So finding what is some area that they may not be lockstep with these really extremist views across the board, and just say, hey, and especially if you can give them a page cite, right? This is the lawyer in me coming out, but if you can say, hey, turn to page 453 and look what it says about this topic, and it's going to be hard for them to just say, oh no, I don't think that's a big deal, when it's right there in front of them.
Yeah, and I think a big part about it is telling, when anybody says, well, how does this matter to you personally? Tell a good story is where I always go. So sometimes with Project 2025, there's the idea in it, which is deeply rooted, to fire a whole chunk of nonpartisan, hardworking civil servants who make sure your water is clean and the air is clean, and going from there. So do you really want someone who's a political appointee trying to figure out, and whether it's a Democrat or Republican, trying to figure out, is your water clean? And think about that next time you open the tap and think, do you really want someone whose best qualification is loyalty to the president to figure out if your drinking water is clean. And that's where I always go, is just tell a personal story of how this could impact you.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. Now, I have thoughts on this next question too. This is a great question. Someone who's thinking toward the future says, should Project 2025 end up being defeated, are there ways to prevent a Project 2029 from emerging 4 years later? And my initial thought on that is, you can see the effect that sunlight has had on this project, where clearly this document was written without the intent of it ever becoming national news. And when people started digging into it and sharing it and discussing it in more detail, that's when the rats started to flee the ship, right? So I think that's the solution. Is there's always going to be groups out there that are proposing horrible ideas, and the answer to that is just to beat them with education, sunlight, and just popularity. Just make it so that it is an indefensible position and it is political kryptonite, where people who are running for office don't want to touch this because they know it's deeply unpopular.
And I think one of the things that recently people have gotten around popularity is that this is what you said, it's a very unpopular agenda. So, but how is it getting a lot of legs is through the courts. And one of the things FFRF has been very much for is basically to expand the Supreme Court with the Judiciary Act that was proposed by Congressional Free Thought Caucus member Hank Johnson from Georgia, and also seconded by Jamie Raskin from Maryland, who's the Congressional Free Thought Caucus co-chair. So you've got that, and yeah, there's a very good chance if this doesn't work out, there's going to be more iterations. So the best way to say that is for the courts to start laying down their markers that no, Trump v. U.S. was very incorrect. Any type of attempts to have an imperial presidency is not in the Constitution. So you're going to need to get new Supreme Court rulings to really, that's the best protection you got against Project 2025.
Yep. Now, we have another question that is on a related concept where they're saying, can something be done about the Heritage Foundation itself as a whole, or is this more of a whack-a-mole situation where other groups will pop up with the same goals? And I think the short answer to that is that it is going to be a bit of a whack-a-mole game. As I said, there are always going to be extremist groups that propose these really bad ideas. I think there's a serious chance that Heritage Foundation seems to be getting itself into hot water here because, we are discussing these policy ideas as a 501c3 may do. But the Heritage Foundation, if you look at how they've been promoting this issue, for example, they sponsored one of the major political parties' conventions recently. So they seem to be really crossing the line of trying to stay nonpartisan, just talking about policies. So, maybe there will be a consequence to that. But if there is, there will be another group that comes and just presents this. So unfortunately, this fight is not going away. If it's not the Heritage Foundation, yes, it will be someone else.
And I think there's just kind of, this is what we talk about a lot, there is almost a huge amount of right-wing money that's floating around, and it's going to want to find a home in some place. So the best thing you can do, re-up your membership to FFRF. And I think on a good end, that's one of the best things you can do for that is help us get the tools to go up against them. We do a really nice job. But if we had just a little bit more, I think we can start really shifting the scales a little bit. We get outspent them by a fair amount, but if we could just get a little closer, that would make a huge difference. Just imagine if we had more lobbyists, more lawyers, we could do more on the ground. I think, so the best investment you can have, FFRF.
Well said. Couldn't have put it better myself. Now, someone else asks about this clip that we showed at the top of the show with the president of the Heritage Foundation, and they say, regarding that clip, do you think supporters of Project 2025 are actually willing to escalate to violence? And Mark, I'm curious your thoughts on this from the DC perspective.
Man, I hope not. For us, it was January 6th was really frightening, and when you talk with people on the Hill, it was essentially, the line was, your colleagues tried to physically harm you. And it was just jarring and frightening, and then how that impacted. So if January 6th is the sneak preview, I hope not. And I hope really, I mean, with the past few years, whether, as you said, sunshine and sunlight coming from the January 6th Commission, I think gave people a lot of pause. And I really hope what's happening is that people saw, wait a second, QAnon isn't just like a little game. This could get very serious. This could get very serious quickly. And I have noticed in DC that there has been a cooling down of temperatures over the past 4 years. That's been a little helpful. And I hope that people start recognizing that politics can be more of a, disagreements are good and that's fine. But as this zero sum, I win, you lose game, it doesn't have to be like that. And I think that there are people who have just had enough of the bad Thanksgivings and the really unhelpful conversations. And I think that you might be even seeing this in Wisconsin, of just, maybe getting off Twitter is a really good idea, and not paying attention to social media quite as much and taking a breath. And I think I've seen just in my own life people getting a little better at that, of just saying, okay, someone said something, maybe we don't need to go full out argument, get out the fangs, and just be like, okay, that was a moment. How do we move forward together?
Sure. And I would hope that, recent events with an attempted assassination of a presidential candidate is also chilling people out a little bit, kind of reflecting on this and saying, all right, this is somewhere we've been before. And, as a, worldwide, we've been here many times before, and it's a path we don't want to go down. So yeah, I really hope that there is this general cooling, but I mean, there's always going to be some, really extreme people who have decided that there's no point left in engaging in dialogue, and all we can do is try to help people stay away from that cliff edge, right?
Mm-hmm. I agree.
Now we got a legal question here, so I'll field this one that asks, are there ways for the Heritage Foundation and their allies to explicitly outlaw dissent from Christianity, such as criminalizing worship of other religions or lack thereof, or is that too extreme for even Christian nationalists? And I mean, it's amazing that this is a reasonable question, and that's incredible to me. If you know anything about the First Amendment, it's the first protection in the Bill of Rights is freedom of religion and the right to a secular government. And so the answer to this should be extremely simple, that no, this is the most blatant imaginable First Amendment violation. This is not going to happen. But the sad reality is there is definitely a contingency of the Christian nationalist heritage foundations who would love to implement this. They are looking back to the way that the colonies were before the United States was a government, where they did implement things like this. And this is why we have the First Amendment. People in the early pre-American colonists who had not learned the lesson from Europe at the time were repeating the same mistakes. And so fortunately, our founders kind of realized this is not going to work. We're not going to be able to live together if we're operating this way. So it's another one of these where I hope that calmer minds prevail. The good news, I suppose, is that we have the legal structure built in where, so long as the First Amendment still exists, what the description here is, I think that it's safe to say, even with the extreme Supreme Court, like again, it's shocking that this would not be a 9-0 decision, but if I had to predict, I think we would probably get 7-2 in favor of reason if there was a government that, that said, we're going to outlaw non-Christian worship, if we're going to outlaw Satanists from practicing their religion privately, something like that. I think we've still got 7 votes on the current Supreme Court to say this is going too far. So for the time being, I think we're safe from those sorts of super extreme situations. But once again, just shocking that we are even having this discussion. It is a good question.
Yeah, that's definitely something I haven't thought about, that some folks would be anti-Hester Prynne, I guess, as it comes down to it. So we'll see what happens. Man, that's a lot to think about.
Right. Now, Mark, for your questions early on about how the impact of Project 2025, a reminder that 10 would be the biggest impact. So I'm seeing 10s and 8s, a 10 with an exclamation point. So I would have been my prediction, but people have confirmed that people agree that this is a huge impact on the 2024 election. So I'm glad that we're talking about it. Again, sad that we had some technical difficulties with David. We'll have to get him back on the show. But that is all the time that we have today on Ask an Atheist. Thank you again for David for coming on to our show this week. And you can follow David's work at The Guardian or by following him on Twitter at SmithInAmerica. That wraps up this week's episode of FFRF's Ask an Atheist. Don't miss our weekly radio show, Free Thought Radio. This week, FFRF co-presidents Annie Laurie Gaylor and Dan Barker will speak with Will Gervais, author of the new book, Disbelief, The Origins of Atheism in a Religious Species. You can find Free Thought Radio at ffrf.org/radio or wherever you get your podcasts.
And be sure to check out the latest episode of We Dissent, the only podcast hosted exclusively by women constitutional lawyers discussing state-church separation. Listen and subscribe to We Dissent wherever you get your podcasts, or check us out online at we-dissent.org.
We also have a lot of fun and irreverent merch available on our online store. We've got t-shirts, bumper stickers, pins, coffee mugs, books, and so much more. You can check all that out by visiting ffrf.org/shop.
And if you want more information about the Freedom from Religion Foundation, check out our website at ffrf.org. If you're already a member, thank you. If not, please join us. And we'll see you next week on FFRF's Ask an Atheist.